I first heard this story from a guy who used to live in my old apartment building, a place I moved out of about 2 years ago. He wasn't the type to make things up, and the way he told it made me feel like he was genuinely shaken by what happened. Let's just call him Mark. He didn't like to talk about it, but over a couple of beers one night, he let the whole thing out. This was back when he'd just moved into that same building, a pretty standard old brick apartment complex in the middle of the city. Nothing special. The kind of place where you heard people's footsteps through the ceiling and smelled their dinners through the walls. He'd been there for only about a month when he first met his next-door neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Adler. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with sharp blue eyes and a quiet, almost distant demeanor. They'd often cross paths in the hallway, and after a couple of brief hellos, they began exchanging casual pleasantries. Mrs. Adler was the type who always wore the same faded floral dress, shuffled quietly in her orthopedic shoes, and held onto her keychain like it was something precious. Mark always thought she seemed lonely, the kind of person who lived in the past, stuck in memories of better times. At first, their conversations were nothing special. A little about the weather, some chit-chat about the noise coming from upstairs. The typical stuff neighbors talk about. But as they spoke more often, Mark started to notice that Mrs. Adler was always on edge, her hands twitching as if she was constantly nervous. And her eyes, they never stayed still, darting around like she expected something to happen. She mentioned her son once in passing, but when Mark asked about him, she quickly changed the subject. Something about her made him feel sorry for her, but he didn't think much beyond that. Then one day she disappeared. It wasn't like she just vanished into thin air, at least not at first. Mark noticed one morning that he hadn't seen Mrs. Adler in a few days. He thought maybe she'd gone to visit family or something, but her mailbox in the lobby started to overflow. A few days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and by then her absence felt eerie. Mark mentioned it to some of the other neighbors, but no one seemed to care. A couple of them just shrugged it off, and the building manager, a gruff guy named Ed, told him to mind his own business. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He knocked on her door a few times, hoping she was just sick or something, but there was never any answer. Her apartment was always quiet, and the silence in that part of the hallway felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out of it. What really got to Mark was that no one else seemed to notice. Everyone just went on with their lives. The building manager didn't do anything, and none of the neighbors seemed to miss her. The mail piled up, and her door stayed closed. It was like she never existed at all. About 3 weeks into Mrs. Adler's absence, Mark decided to report it to the building management again. This time, Ed gave him a weird look, as if he didn't know who Mark was talking about. When Mark insisted, Ed told him, flat out, that there was no one by the name of Mrs. Adler living in the building. Mark was floored. "What do you mean she doesn't exist?" he asked. Ed shrugged, completely unfazed. "There's no one by that name in our records, no one in that apartment. You sure you're not just imagining things?" That comment set Mark off. He knew Mrs. Adler was real. He'd spoken to her. He'd seen her walking the halls every day. But Ed just shook his head and walked away, leaving Mark standing there, more confused than ever. Something was definitely wrong. Mrs. Adler was real. He wasn't imagining it. But why would the building manager claim she never existed? It didn't make any sense. That night, Mark sat in his apartment, staring at the wall that separated his place from hers. His mind raced with possibilities. Had she moved out without telling anyone? Was there something more sinister going on? The more he thought about it, the more obsessed he became. He couldn't just let it go. A few nights later, Mark made a decision. He waited until the building was quiet, and then, with his heart pounding in his chest, He crept out into the hallway. He had an old lock-picking set he'd messed around with in college, and he brought it with him. It felt wrong, but he had to know what had happened to Mrs. Adler. The lock on her door was old and rusty, and it didn't take long to get it open. When the door clicked, Mark hesitated, his hand on the knob. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but what he found was far worse than anything he could have imagined. The first thing that hit him was the smell, a thick, rotting stench that made his stomach churn. He gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Mark reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that the place was a mess. The furniture was overturned, and there were deep gouges in the walls, like someone had clawed at them in desperation. Papers were scattered everywhere, old bills, receipts, and what looked like handwritten letters. The air was thick with dust, and everything felt cold, like the place had been abandoned for a long time. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the living room, there was blood. A lot of it. Dark, dried stains soaked into the carpet, splattered across the floor, and smeared along the walls. Mark's mind went blank for a moment, his thoughts racing too fast to make sense of what he was seeing. Something terrible had happened here. He moved further into the apartment, careful not to touch anything. The bathroom door was ajar, and as he nudged it open, he froze. The mirror was shattered, shards of glass glinting in the faint light, and scrawled across the broken surface, in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "They took me. You're next." Mark stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind screamed at him to get out, but something compelled him to keep going. He needed to know what had happened. He couldn't just leave without understanding. He moved towards the bedroom, every step heavier than the last. When he pushed open the door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the bed, lying twisted and broken, was a body, or what was left of one. The figure was so mutilated it was hard to tell if it was even human anymore. Flesh hung loosely from the bones, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. Mark couldn't breathe. His eyes locked onto the ruined face. It was Mrs. Adler. She'd been dead for days, maybe weeks. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. It was clear she had died in agony, but there were no obvious signs of what had killed her. No weapons, no tracks, nothing. Just a cold, violent death in a forgotten apartment. Mark backed away slowly, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out. He turned and bolted for the door, slamming it behind him as he stumbled into the hallway. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. Who had taken her? What did the message in the mirror mean? Was someone coming for him next? For the next few days, Mark kept to himself. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He considered going to the police, but what would he even say? That he broke into his neighbor's apartment and found her dead? That the building manager claimed she never existed? It sounded insane. And then, strange things started happening. It was small stuff at first. Noises in the walls, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Mark tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the sounds grew louder every night. Scratching, tapping. Like something or someone was inside the walls, trying to get out. Then one night, he woke up to the sound of footsteps in his apartment. His heart raced as he sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. He grabbed a baseball bat from under his bed and crept out into the hallway. The apartment was dark, but he could feel that he wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, "You're next." Mark swung the bat wildly, but there was nothing there, just empty space. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed into his bedroom and locked the door. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they filled the entire apartment. The next morning, Mark packed up whatever he could carry and left. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just ran. I moved into that building a few months after Mark left, completely unaware of what had happened. It wasn't until I ran into him at a bar, years later, that I heard the story. He told me he never found out what really happened to Mrs. Adler or who or what had killed her.
Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, and we'll notify you when the next story comes out.